I'd like to now introduce our main speaker. Many of you who've been with the club for some time know Debbie, but for those of you who have never met her before, Debbie is an avid eclipse chaser, and she just got back from seeing another eclipse. And she's observed, is it 15 still, or is this now 16, Debbie?
This was the 15th.
This was the 15th.
Total, 5 annulars.
Okay, so she's observed 15 total, 5 annular eclipses. She's also very lucky in this. She's only been clouded out on 2 occasions. So, it's kind of tough to make it around the world to be clouded out, but you've had a good streak there going. Debbie's had a lifelong interest in astronomy since her childhood in Midland, Texas, where all the scenery is the sky. She's been a longtime member of the Houston Astronomical Society and participates in HAS outreach programs and volunteer telescope operator at the George Observatory in Brazos Bend State Park. She is also a major advocate for responsible night lighting, and in 2017 was recognized by the International Dark Sky Association with the Hoag Robinson Award for Education of Government Officials about outdoor lighting issues. In 2010, her Woodside neighborhood became the first one within the Houston city limits allowed to install low glare, fully shielded decorative lights. So with that, Debbie, I would like to welcome you to the meeting, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. So I just want to say hello. I'm Debbie Moran. I'm wearing my Grand Tetons Eclipse t-shirt, although I was a little bit west of there in Victor, Idaho. And let me go ahead and share my slides, if I may.
And while you're doing that, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have questions of Debbie throughout the course of this conversation, please use the chat function that we have within Zoom, and we will get to your questions in the order that they're received.
Okay, so I'm hiding the meeting controls, so hopefully we don't have any rectangles over it. I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. That can be seen, Joe? 1 minute.
It can, yeah.
Let me see if it's going to not start. Okay, there we go.
There we go. No gray boxes or anything like that, so it looks good.
Yeah, so we call ourselves eclipse chasers, therefore I call this talk Total Eclipse, the Thrill of the Chase. And the reason for that is that it's a little bit like a kaleidoscope. I hope everybody will be inspired to see at least one total eclipse sometime in their life, but no two are alike. There's different cultural experiences. The corona is always different. The length is different. And after chasing 15 totals now and 5 annulars, I've seen quite a broad spectrum of eclipses. I will hopefully give you an idea of what it's like to chase eclipses around the world, even if you do only 2 or 3, and how to do it efficiently with the best experience. And then once you do see an eclipse, what to look for, which is a little difficult. There's so many things to see in such a short time. So first of all, what is a total eclipse? Well, every 1 to 2 years, a miracle occurs on Earth. At a little narrow strip of land, the new moon is so perfectly sized and so perfectly aligned with the sun that it passes in front of the sun and covers just enough photosphere that for the first time you can see the corona. It's the only time our eyes can see the corona, because normally it's so much fainter than the surface of the sun and it's impossible to see without the moon blocking it out. This photo is by Byron Braswell. It was taken at Clifton Beach, a little bit north of Cairns, Australia, in 2012. And it's very similar to the photograph that I saw in 5th grade in my science textbook. And I remember seeing the corona and hearing that the stars come out. I was like, I have to see that sometime. So eventually I convinced my parents to take me to my first eclipse, which I will cover a little bit later. However, it turns out that sometimes people are smitten with eclipses and they'll chase them all over the world. And every time we go, the tour guides are like, why are you coming over here for 3 minutes? And every time they see the eclipse, they say, oh, now I get it. So these are eclipse chasers. This is actually on a Transit of Venus trip. But sometimes various tour operators, in this case, Paul Mayleys, which is eclipsetours.com, get devotees, and we start seeing the same people over and over again on these trips. The women are there also. We're all behind the cameras taking this picture. So why is that? Why do we chase eclipses? Well, it's a bit of a miracle when you think about it, because the Earth has only one moon, unlike some of our other planets, which have up to 92 moons, like someplace like Jupiter or Saturn. But we have exactly one, and it's happens to be 400 times as small as the sun, but it also it's 400 times closer to us than the sun. And that means that the apparent size of the moon and the apparent size of the sun are very, very similar. But we don't get a total eclipse every single month because the moon's orbit around the Earth is inclined at 5 degrees to the Earth's orbit around the sun. So most of the time at full moon, when you could possibly have a total lunar eclipse, or at new moon, when you could possibly have a solar eclipse, the moon is too high or too low to be aligned with the sun. But at times, the moon is placed exactly where those two orbits cross, called the nodes. And that's when you're able to have these total lunar eclipses and total solar eclipses. They have to be perfectly lined up, and that just doesn't happen very often. We also have different kinds of eclipses because the apparent size of the sun and the apparent size of the moon can vary. So the Earth's orbit around the sun is elliptical, and therefore the sun is sometimes a little farther away from us and sometimes a little bit closer. And this is a good schematic side-by-side of the smallest and the largest the sun can appear in the sky. And meanwhile, the same thing happens actually to a greater extent with the moon's orbit. So it can vary quite a bit in its size and its distance. Its average distance is 238,000 miles, but it can be as close to us as 225,000 miles plus some change, or as far away from us as 252,000 miles. That means we have different combinations of the size of the moon covering the sun. So in this cartoon at the right side, you'll see what happens when the moon centers on the sun, but is too small to cover it. And that's called an annular eclipse because that ring of photosphere of the sun around the moon is called an annulus, but you do not see the corona. When the moon is closer to us relative to the sun, then it completely covers the photosphere, and then we can see the glory of the corona. Now, what we eclipse chasers find is that one of the reasons it's so difficult to convince people to go to their first eclipse is that they think they've seen a total eclipse when they haven't. So even if it's 99.9%, that's not good enough. You don't get the corona and you don't get the rush of the impressive darkness. It's amazing how little light you need to make it look somewhat light outside. So you've got to have a total eclipse, which means that you must be inside the path of totality. People are outside the path. Those are the people who get the partial eclipses until they're so far away that there's no eclipse. So this is an annular eclipse taken by HAS member Joe Dellinger. And this does show you that you can get a very attractive, pretty view of an eclipse. Annular eclipses are worth seeing also. And we do have one of these coming up in Texas on October 14th of this year. And it's especially pretty sight when it's low on the horizon. In that case, there's enough filtration from the atmosphere that a picture like this can be taken without a filter safely. Just like sometimes when the sun is setting, it appears like a red ball and you can just look at it without needing some kind of special glasses. But for a total eclipse, you have to be in the dark part of the shadow. You can see that in this picture that the penumbra is quite large. Everybody all over this large piece of the Earth sees a partial eclipse like this, but only the people in this narrow strip, a dark strip, can see a total eclipse. This is why if you want to see a lot of them, you have to travel the world. They don't come to any one spot on the world very often. And we just saw one. This is actually a spectacular picture that just came up on April 20th from a Japanese satellite that was going to be landing on the moon. I think it crashed into the moon. And this is an amazing picture of what we just saw from the moon. This little black eye here is the April 20th, 23 eclipse shadow on the Earth as taken from the moon. There's also something called a hybrid eclipse. And this is sort of a combination annular and total. And it's when the size of the moon is so close to the size of the sun that it actually makes a difference where on the Earth you are. If you're on the part of the Earth that's closest to the moon, you get a total eclipse. And if you're at the edges of the path where the curvature of the Earth is taking farther away from the moon, it doesn't quite cover and you get an annular eclipse. That's the kind of eclipse that we just had on just a couple of weeks ago in Australia. So to see the total eclipse, you had to be in the central part of the path. When you have a hybrid eclipse, there's a maximum length that the totality can be and still have it only be annular at the very ends of the path. And that maximum is about 1 minute and 49 seconds or so. So these, of necessity, are short total eclipses. But there is a reason to see a short total eclipse. I happen to be in Panama where this eclipse was annular in 2005, but people who were way out in the ocean got a total eclipse for a little over a minute, 1 minute. And what happens when the moon is actually, I believe this one was 30 seconds. When the moon's smaller, you see all these beautiful prominences around the edge of the moon or solar flares all the way around. For a longer eclipse, these appear sequentially. So you will have an especially spectacular inner corona for a short eclipse. So there are reasons to see all sorts of different lengths of eclipses. The shortest one I've seen was 10 seconds. It's definitely the most spectacular inner corona I've seen. Because these are short, you may also want it to be a part of the world that you would want to see for other reasons. You can always get clouded out. So eclipse travel is a combination of going to a part of the world that you think will be interesting, and then hopefully having this extra experience of eclipse chasing with your colleagues. So we actually have all three of these within the space of a year. We just had the April 20th, 2023 eclipse, a hybrid eclipse in Western Australia and Indonesia, and a lot of the ocean. It was actually off the west coast of Australia. On October 14th, we are fortunate to be in the right place for an annular eclipse in the US. It goes all the way through the most beautiful areas of the Southwest, through Mexican Hat, Utah, and the travel takes people to the Grand Canyon. It's not at the Grand Canyon, but Albuquerque's on the center line, Midland, Texas is on the center line, San Antonio's in the path. The closest place to us is Corpus Christi, but it actually does not have the very best weather prospects. So you might want to go farther west or just try your luck in Corpus Christi for the October 14th annular. And then the big one is April 8th, 2024. And we are fortunate to be in Texas. Mexico has the very best weather, closer to Mazatlan, but in the entire United States, Texas has by far the best chance of steering clear of the clouds on April 8th. So if you do see an eclipse, you need to know a few basic eclipse terms. We have a name for these tangential contacts between the moon and the sun. When you see the first bite taken out of the sun, it's called first contact. Then you have the partial phases. Then when the moon touches the far side of the sun's photosphere, that's second contact. Then you have totality shortly after the sun starts to emerge from the moon, that's third contact. And then you have some more partial phases, and fourth contact is the real end of the eclipse, and the moon has completely left the face of the sun. So I have that in diagrams and photographs. Here's the first little bite. That's actually really fun to catch. You've been planning to see this eclipse for a couple of years, and then you know exactly the right time and the second for your location. And sure enough, that first bite of the sun is taken out, and it looks like it's exactly centered like you hoped. During the partial phases, it's nice to keep track of it. I just look occasionally, but if you have either binoculars or a telescope and can see significant sunspots, it's fun to watch the Earth's shadow cross over a sunspot, because that's one time when you actually can perceive motion as it's happening because of the relationship between the moon when it's crossing in front of something very close to it. Second contact is when totality begins. We cannot, with photographs, take a picture of the outer corona and the inner corona at the same time. Your eyes will see that. They'll see all these prominences here, and they'll see the big splashy outer corona, but the camera cannot do that. So second contact, we see the last little bit of the sun's photosphere disappearing behind the last mountain valley of the moon, and that's called the diamond ring. And here's a beautiful diamond ring photo. Fourth contact is at the end of the eclipse, and I put it blank here because often people are packing up as soon as totality ends, and not that many people stick around unless they're trying to do a series like this. To observe eclipses safely, both you and your equipment need a safe solar filter, and it must be one that's made specifically for viewing the sun. Don't try to do 5 sunglasses or something like that. You really need to cut out something like 99.9% of the sun's light to see it safely. So there's neutral density filters. There's welder's glass. Numbers 12, 13, and 14 are okay. But unsafe that we see often people try in other countries are CDs, aluminized food packaging, exposed color film, smoke glass. But the good news is that really good filtration, especially in terms of filter material you can get for your equipment or for your eyes, is very, very, very inexpensive. If you are using equipment to try to photograph or even just view the sun, these days you can just use a zoom lens or a digital camera that zooms to actually get a very good view, close-up view of the sun. But you need your filtration during the partial phases at the very front surface of it. So before the sun's light hits any other parts of your camera or binoculars, not at the very end, that you can burn out your optics. If you're trying to aim a telescope, you have to do that trial and error with using the shadow and trying to make the roundest shape that you can on the ground, and then using a right angle finder to trial and error find the sun. There are mounts which have a clock drive which can follow the sun so that once you locate it, it will stay put. Having said this, I do not advise photographing your first eclipse. It will distract you and you will actually miss a lot of the experience. I just do a quick point and shoot just to get the general scene. I know there are always people out there with extremely good equipment who will get the best photos. The photos are spectacular. They're still not what you see with your naked eye. If you are photographing, though, there's something called the hat trick. And you're going to see this a little bit in one of the videos that I'm going to show. What happens is if you have a filter on your optics, you want it to fit fairly tightly. And then there's a point where you're trying to transition from taking a filtered picture to an unfiltered shot when you no longer need the filter during totality. When you take that filter off, the camera's going to shake a little bit. So what you do is you take the filter off maybe 30 seconds a minute early, but you still protect your optics by holding up something like a piece of cardboard or a hat in front of your camera. And then when it's time to take your totality shots, you just whip it away. There's no vibration on your camera. For your face, these are some Eclipse glasses here. And this picture's probably better. These are some women I met in Australia in 2012, Emma and Trude. They are from the Philippines, although Emma's been living in Los Angeles for probably 40 years by now. And one thing I learned from them was that you can do independent travel very easily if you're just traveling alone. You don't always have to go with a group. They routinely travel independently, and we tried that a little bit later on. When you do travel to these different countries, they all have their own style of eclipse glasses. So you will feel like you have a souvenir of that particular experience in that particular culture. Amazon got into trouble last time around 2017 for including some counterfeit sellers of glasses. They now are very careful about making you have these CE and ISO certified glasses. One of the most reputable makers is called Rainbow Symphony, but these glasses are now marked with certification so you know that they are safe. You can test your glasses by holding them up to the sun, or first hold them up to a lamp or just general daylight. You should see absolutely zero. If there's any scratches or thin spots and any light comes through at all, they're not good. When you look at the sun, it should be comfortable to look at, and the sun's edges should be very hard, not fuzzy at all. So what you can do if you do not have glasses is you can project the sun. So colanders are excellent for that. This is an Airbnb we stayed at in Chile in 2019. I happened to have a former violin student who went back to Santiago. This is his wife and his young son. And we just brought down the colander from our Airbnb kitchen, and you go get this beautiful array of multiple crescent suns. You can also see these often through tree leaves. This is through palm tree leaves on the same fence. When you decide to travel to eclipses, one of the easiest ways to do it is to find a good tour operator There are a number of tour operators who are extremely experienced. I tend to go with Ring of Fire. This is Paul Maley and his wife, Lynn Palmer, at the 2012 Australian Eclipse. If you go on an all-inclusive tour like this, they will get you the hotels. They will get you to a lot of the best sightseeing in a short time. It's very efficient. And they will make an effort to get you to a clear sky. Paul often will have a couple of different sites that you can choose from. One of the reasons I've been successful is when there are two sites, I'm very good at choosing the one that sees it if one of them is not as successful. And that came actually from my experience in learning how to fly airplanes. I learned a little bit more about weather and clouds and how they worked. So to choose a site for an eclipse, this is what the professionals do. They choose the least cloud interference. So they check the weather statistics for that particular month and find the clearest spot or the statistically clearest spot along the path. Is it accessible? Can you get there on a road? Or if you're in a cruise ship, can you get there on a cruise ship? The proximity to the center line, the closer you are to the center of that path, the longer totality is for that particular eclipse. And I also like to look for a road that runs along the path instead of across it, so that if you do have to run because of clouds, the road you're on will keep you within the path of totality. You also want a good place to visit because there's no guarantees you'll see the eclipse. You never know if cloudiness will come over it. And a cruise is often considered a good way to go because they have some flexibility to chase the holes in the clouds. This is Javier Ubier's interactive Google map, and it's invaluable. I'll show you that at the end of the talk. This is the path for the 2024 eclipse. You can see how it runs through the hill country and South Texas and over Dallas. And it can be enlarged, and you can actually look at an individual house, click on it, and get the exact statistics, the timings for the eclipse, the direction, how high up in the sky it is, even the speed of the moons of the sun, sorry, the shadow rushing towards you. Still, you might not think of everything. So we were in a very clear spot in Zambia in 2001, but that was the day the farmers decided to do some burnings. Fortunately, this smoke was actually opposite part of the sky for us from the sun, but if it had been in the direction of the sun, it would have been a disaster. And actually mentioning this is also the risk for the 2017 eclipse. The best weather was in the west, but we were just praying there wouldn't be any wildfires at that time. So getting the most out of an eclipse. So first of all, I was fortunate to hear Norm Sperling talk early on before I ever saw my first eclipse. He's an amateur astronomer out of California. And he mentioned that your first eclipse will seem incredibly short. He has this theory, no matter how long totality is, you will think it lasted only 8 seconds. His theory is to do something that is not intuitive. Don't just stare at totality the entire time. He thinks that what happens is that when you have one image in your mind, your memory of it compresses into a very short time. So his advice is look at the sun, sketch it, look around, see the sunset colors, look at listen for the animals to vary your experience during totality, and it will seem longer. And I didn't follow his advice at first, and then I did, and he was absolutely right. I had a 4-minute eclipse that seemed to go by in a flash, but all I was doing was staring at it through my zoom lens, and a 2-minute eclipse, I could really feel the whole 2 minutes. That 2-minute eclipse actually felt longer to me. So the problem, though, with eclipse chasing is that there are 3 things that happen in the last minute before totality that require you to focus on different places. So, and they're all really interesting to see. This is one of the advantages of seeing multiple eclipses. You might miss one phenomenon at one eclipse and then catch it at another. I actually decide which one I most want to see. So the first one is Bailey's beads. So as the crescent sun gets stopped down even more, eventually the moon's bumpy edge, because you've got mountains and valleys on the edge, start to break up that crescent, and you start to see these beads of light form between the mountains. That's a very beautiful sight. There are some people who travel to the edge of the path where you get less totality, but they have this prolonged forming of beads of light, and unforming happens for a much longer time. They are also getting some useful scientific data on the profile of the moon and the size of the sun and the moon when they measure this. However, at the same time, there can also be shadow bands. This is a phenomenon that happens only sometimes, but it is the light of the sun being refracted through a very narrow slit through the Earth's atmosphere. And this is the best video of shadow bands I've ever seen. They are usually very, very faint. They're going to start out faint here, but I'm going to take you to 30 seconds or so before totality. And this is very close to what your eye sees. In all of these videos, it's unmistakable when totality hits. Notice the shadow of the camera on the right, what's going to happen to it. Now, at the same time that's happening, you might have to turn your back to the sun to see the shadow approaching you. I've done that twice now, once in Idaho, and then I chose to do that also in Australia. And this is the best video I've seen of that. This is real time, about the last minute before totality.
Yeah. It looks like the mountains in shadow over there already. Yeah.
Well, it's like you can't see the shadow, but you can see that it's not there, if that makes sense.
By the way, this shadow is coming at them at 1,700 miles per hour.
Oh, look at this.
Whoa! Oh, man. Dit is zo gaaf. Wow.
This is dusk, but it's sped up. This is true time lapse.
Yes, jongens.
Het was 2 seconden. Ja, kijk, kijk. Oh!
Whoa!
See the stars?
Whoa!
Stars out.
Woo!
So it's obvious when the diamond ring hits. This is Joe Dellinger's view. He's a member of our society, of the shadow in Hawaii receding from the sun. But at the same time that's happening, you can watch the Bailey's beads stop down to the diamond ring. I actually have never seen the shadow completely come over because I'm too busy turning around to see this.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Take that one off.
Filters off. Glasses off. Glasses off. Glasses Start getting off. Ready. Don't look quite yet. Don't look quite yet. Shadow's coming. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6,
Diamond ring! Diamond ring! Diamond ring!
So I actually think that the sound of an eclipse is more accurate than the pictures of the eclipse, because what they're seeing is not anything you've seen so far in the photos and the videos. This is Joe Dellinger's beautiful portrait of the diamond ring wide field in Hawaii. So the other aspect of eclipse chasing is the world travel aspect. Instead of going to a travel agent and saying, gee, I'd like to visit Spain this year, or Hawaii or wherever it is, it's like throwing a dart at the map and traveling wherever it lands. So by following the sun around the world, or the sun or the moon, these are all the places that I've seen. And this is since 1983. This is not an inexpensive hobby. I started out slow. My first 2 eclipses were 8 years apart. As my means increased and I grew older and I retired, I've been able to travel more. But I discovered early on, when I convinced my parents somehow to get us to Indonesia in 1983, we had done no world travel at all. And I remember it was $3,000 for 3 weeks. And I was thinking, oh my God, this is so much expense that's only occurs over 1 week of my life, $1,000 per week. This just seems totally extravagant. But I'm glad I learned back then, when I was 23 years old, that expenditure isn't for just the 3 weeks. It sticks with me still even now. The memories and the depth that I find when I travel the world are well worth the expense. Now, when I hear news from parts of the world, it's not just an abstract point on a map. The people are not this invisible amorphous thing. I see real people at these places. So my first eclipse was in Surabaya, Indonesia. I want to talk about it a bit because I think I did everything right for a first eclipse chase, my first eclipse experience. This was a nice, generous eclipse, similar to the one we're going to have in Texas, where we had 4.5 minutes of totality. We traveled to other countries, of course. There was Taiwan and Singapore and 24 hours in Bangkok. And one thing the eclipse does is that it often gets you to the parts of the country that don't always have tourists. So in this case, we were in the second largest city on Java, in Surabaya, Indonesia. And here we are on the roof of our hotel. Now, we had an excursion that went about 3 hours north of the hotel, out in nature, hoping to have lots of animals. Well, we were the ones that had the animals. It turned out that there were so many groups on the road, there wasn't an animal or an insect in sight. We were very close to the zoo. There were roosters crowing. We had actually a cacophony of animals on top of the roof. The other thing I liked about being on top of a roof is we could see as the city darkened, the street lights came on. What I did, rather than taking any major pictures, was I took out a notebook and I documented everything as much as I could. So these are my notes. At 10:40, this is a Muslim country. So we heard at first loudspeakers advising townspeople against looking up at the sun. Unfortunately, a lot of these countries, they don't feel confident about when to look, or they don't know that you can look at totality, or they may not have the filtration they need to look at the partial phases. I heard a rooster crow at 10:53. Then at 11:15, we started hearing this cacophony coming from the zoo, which was about 3/4 of a mile away. And it went all the way through totality. Eventually, then the street lights turned on. Then we had chanting and praying from the mosques. And those people, by the way, that we saw up there on the roof, they looked at the partial phases, but I saw them on their prayer mats praying during totality. Totality was still probably the prettiest corona I've seen. And I remember the more experienced people were saying it was the prettiest corona they had seen. It was a large, brilliant kind of flower petal-like corona with long streamers. And I didn't know about prominences, so I was surprised to see what looked like little bits as if someone were pointing red laser light pointers at you around in various places around the sun. And I could see Venus and Sirius visibly naked eye. Mars and Betelgeuse, I had a good pair of binoculars, were visible with the sun in my binoculars. And then I documented the following diamond ring when the sun begins to reemerge. So what I did, and I was the only person who did this, is I decided to just take my little point and shoot camera and choose a direction and just watch it darken. I now know from experience that sometimes I start 20 minutes before, but you don't get really major differences until about the last 7 minutes. The darkening is much more pronounced at that time. So if you do that 7 minutes before, then 2 minutes, that's when you really see a big difference. And there are the street lights coming on at the bottom. I also decided to sketch. And if you have the time to do this, these are the coronas I remember best, are the ones I took out pencil and paper and sketched the outline of them. So I used just these dark areas were what appeared to be red laser light to me. And this is the way I depicted them. There was some brushiness here. And to me, I thought the the streamers in the corona had fairly good definition. They had really defined shapes. Soon after, the cover of Sky and Telescope magazine came out, and this is a composite photo, even getting this much detail in the outer corona. I think they had to use a radial filter. You had to differentially filter out the inner corona more than the outer corona to get this much definition. Usually just get a wash of white light for the corona if you just point a camera and do a single exposure. So there is my sketch next to the camera, but the camera actually did not see as much as I saw. I had all these brilliant red prominences, and this streamer that fades out in the camera really was all the way down to here. It was huge. So again, this is one of those things like some music that's way better live than recorded. You need to plan for the weather, but sometimes the best laid plans don't always work. So in 1991, the big 7-minute eclipse, my boyfriend went to Baja California, which was crystal clear on the day as it was expected to be. But right at totality, some of the people who traveled away from the hotel had a few cirrus clouds come over, and it wasn't a disaster. They could see the sun through them, but they didn't have perfectly clear corona. I was north of Puerto Vallarta because of the short trip. It worked with my Houston Symphony schedule. It left on a Tuesday, which is what works for us musicians. And so I went to the west coast of Mexico, and we had partly cloudy skies, was expected. We had this huge oval cloud around the partial phases. We could see through it, but we were getting really, really worried. In fact, half of us left and went to the beach. And that was the time I lucked out. I just had everything all set up, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to hope for the best. I can't take everything down and go to the beach at the last minute. We ended up being the lucky ones. The people at the beach ended up getting clouded out. Our clouds parted 7 minutes before totality. We saw the whole glorious 7 minutes of the corona. And then 7 minutes soon after totality, the cloud reformed over the sun. These kinds of things can happen because the temperature drop is so dramatic. You often drop about 16 degrees between the ambient temperature of the day and totality. And then the other thing is that my roommate, I had a post-college roommate at the time, sharing an apartment, was taking a Spanish course in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And I sent her some filtration material. And I said, well, I don't know if you're going to do okay. You've got a 90% chance of cloudiness. It was at a time of the day where clouds routinely form in the mountains. She was the one who had the perfectly cloudless skies and the eclipsed sun over the pyramids that she was at. So you don't know for that day. You want to plan for the best, but you never know what's going to happen on that day. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural experience, because that varies from eclipse to eclipse. One of the beauties of eclipse chasing is that you do all the regular sightseeing that everybody does. When we went to Turkey in 1999, we went to Istanbul and saw the Hagia Sophia, saw the mosques, went to Cappadocia to see the amazing geology there. But then we also went to Eastern Turkey, where very few people travel, especially this little tiny town, Batman, Turkey, which was closest to our site, which was in the desert, very close to the Iraq border. And so when we were a huge event. When we were riding around in our cars, all these kids would chase behind us and wave at us. And then we found that there was this huge entourage waiting for us when we were getting on the bus to go to the eclipse. That's one of the things I love about eclipse chasing, is seeing parts of the world that people don't always get to. You may do things that you never thought you would do. So for the Iceland annular eclipse, we had a day trip to Greenland, and I was thrilled that after hiking out, they would take us back on dog sleds if we wished back to the airport. You also go to places you think you might have never gone. In 2006, Libya was actually opening up with its relations with the West, and was actually one of the 50 top places to go in the New York Times that year. And that's because they have a lot to offer, which maybe we don't in the West don't know about. They have beautiful sand dunes, apparently in the western half of the country, with mountains behind. And it's that combination is very rare. It's a beautiful place to visit. That spectacular Roman ruins, cobalt blue Mediterranean Sea. But of course, they have a lot of political problems. I don't know how many times we heard people tell us, go home and tell your fellow Americans, we are not our government. We heard that a lot. But I'm going to focus a little bit on this because I think this is my most fascinating trip. We did not go to what I call the tourist desert. We went to the eastern half of Libya because the desert's very, very flat. In fact, it's so flat, it's like the largest parking lot of sand you've ever seen in your life. The good thing about this is that the shadow bands were spectacular in the desert. The reason we chose this was because it minimized the chances of blowing dust. The weather chances were excellent, but dust storms were a risk. In fact, it turns out that the camp that they had set up for us had blown down in a dust storm about 3 days before we arrived. We expected little tiny pup tents and a hole in the ground to go to the bathroom, but we were shocked to find that we had the Libyan version of glamping. They set up these room-sized tents with jute rugs and linens. They had flush toilets and showers for us. I told my parents, I'm going to be out in the middle of nowhere. I won't be able to communicate with you. Then the last day I found out they had the internet tent with free Wi-Fi and 20 computers set up in there. They had the most beautiful eclipse stamps I've seen. In fact, that's where we got our first day cover sign, was in the internet tent. And they have spectacular Roman ruins. So if they could ever get the right government, they could be a wonderful tourist spot. This is Sabratha, the second largest Roman ruin city in Libya, and these are on the Mediterranean Sea. These are young women. Libya has the best school architecture I've ever seen. It's like, why didn't we think of that? They had co-ed education in elementary school and in high school, but they have single-sex education in middle school. Seems like a great system. So these are middle school girls who are visiting Sabratha. These are some women who were there. This is the huge Roman city of Leptis Magna. It's enormous. And some of these places have withstood earthquakes, or they've had an earthquake, and then they take the same materials and reconstruct what they can. But sometimes dictators are a little bit comical. We saw all sorts of huge posters of Gaddafi with Marvin Zindler-like sunglasses, blue sunglasses, things like that. And I kept asking everybody for their 1 dinar notes because his pose tickled me, exactly like Jack Benny. A few years later, this is the 1 dinar note, revolutionaries. I also learned early on travel that really helps your experience to learn what I call a little bit of travelese, how to count, how to order food, how to say hello. And it can be like magic words. In Turkey, we were out watching the Perseids. We were there in August, and we had this spectacular night sky with the Perseids near an airport. Everybody was lying down on the ground. And then these 2 guys came up with these really bright white flashlights. And our tour operator was like waving his hands in front of them, saying, no, 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 trying to, in English, of course, trying to get them to turn off the lights. Turn off the lights, turn off the lights. And I remembered how to say, hello, how are you? Or good evening in Turkish. And there had been one phrase in all the dialogues I was reading in my book that I could remember. And I was so upset because I couldn't remember anything I was supposed to say. I could only remember what the waiter was supposed to say in response, which is "Bir dakika lütfen," 1 moment, please. So these guys had rifles over their shoulders, which Paul couldn't see because of the flashlights. So I said, good evening in Turkish. And I said, "Bir dakika lütfen," 1 moment, please. And they went, oh, and they just waited patiently. I ran and got the sleeping bus driver, and he found out they were beekeepers, wondering what we were doing there. But 1 moment, please, turned out to come in handy, the one phrase I didn't think I was actually going to need in Turkey. In Libya, I learned how to say, hello, how are you? And it just created enormous goodwill. This was at a time that we had our Middle East war, and we're shooting people, trying to get them to halt at checkpoints in English. Well, I learned how to say, my name is Debbie, and hello, how are you, in modern Arabic, which is not what they really speak, but they can all understand. And people would just fall all over themselves when I said that. So these are shipbuilders in Benghazi, and they were like, well, come on up. So they invited me up. Everybody was pushing me up onto the ship frame, and we did a photo opportunity. These are men in the fish market in Benghazi. This was the most beautiful young child I've ever seen. I asked his mother if I could take a picture. I could, in my 3 words of Arabic, and she allowed me to do that. So now when I see news about Benghazi, I have this concrete view of Benghazi. I see people there, and it's not so abstract anymore. These are the daughters, oldest daughters of our tour guide, Jamal, who was very liberal minded. And we had told him that we wanted to go take him and his family to an authentic Libyan restaurant for the last night. So he put us all on the bus and we came up to this nondescript rectangular building, very plain on the outside. And we're like, where are we? He invited us up into his apartment. His sister, who was a lawyer, had fixed this 7-course meal. We were 17 people. And we met his daughters, who ranged in age from the older daughters from 25 to about 7. And it was wonderful. These are Tibetan students on the train from Jining to Lhasa, Tibet from the 2009 eclipse. And in Wuhan, ironically, this is the one place that our eclipse featured a bat. I did not know this until I got home. I say I haven't been clouded out. This one, we really only got the inner corona. But I want to mention something about weather for this eclipse. Most of China was clouded out, but I was watching the satellite, and the clouds kept parting around the central lake in Wuhan. And Paul had his kind of set places to see the eclipse, either at the hotel or north of the airport. And I realized later on that if we had been on the correct shore of the lake, we would have had this big, clear piece of sky. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of our sky was clear, and there had been these mackerel clouds, and they sort of oozed over the sun. So we saw it in and out of the clouds. But the lucky thing is because I saw them in and out of the clouds, I swung my camera down toward the horizon. And Wuhan and so many of these other cities are so polluted, it was not beautiful sunset colors. It was very rusty. I'm going to start this video and play just a bit of the beginning to give you the general scene at the hotel. And then the sun kind of went in and out. And about here, and I'm going to stop it for just a second when it comes up. So I'm going to stop this for just a minute. You won't have much time. When you see the buildings come up on the horizon, very shortly after that, focus on the right-hand building. There's one off by itself. And from about the middle of that building, I thought it was a piece of paper that kind of blew in the eclipse. And I sent this to somebody who said, oh, nice bat action. So watch the bat fly from right to left. Here it comes. Watch the right-hand building. So the bat was, I was told that it was a traditional, that's the way a bat flies. And also it did a figure 8 capture of an insect. So I'm going to mention a little bit about the stands, because this is where I learned a little bit more about just other people's. This was not an eclipse trip. It was the transit of Venus, which we observed in Turkmenistan. But I remember before we went, I was told that, why are you going to Uzbekistan? I have a cousin who's a lawyer who's worked on sex trafficking. It was in the news for all sorts of problems. I think they're in the news again now. But you learn that people are people. So this was women dancing in Samarkand. And we had one of our members of our group was doing some flag dancing behind them. And toward the end, this is short, but watch what the women do when the photographer gets distracted by our guy. And for me, Uzbekistan is a country with the best art direction. These are folk dancers. This is the very colorful fabrics they have. The women are smiling with their mouths closed because Uzbekistan does have universal health care, but they don't have universal dental care. This is Ulugh Observatory, which is a great example of the golden age of Islamic science. Ulugh was a leader, kind of a brutal leader at the time, but he also created a catalog of over 1,000 stars. He determined the length of the sidereal year to within 25 seconds, actually bettering Copernicus. And he created trigonometry tables to sines and tangents accurate to 8 places. This sextant is very similar to the one at Griffith Observatory, has a similar transit telescope. This is a Darvaza gas crater where we observed the transit of Venus. I think it's still burning. It started burning natural gas. It was an accident when Russians were drilling for gas, and it's been burning ever since 1971. This is it at night. We camped out there. And this is a sun spotter, which was used in this case for the transit of Venus, but it's an excellent instrument if you can carry it around. It's not too heavy, but it's probably the best for the clearest views of partial phases of eclipses also, the sun spotter. This is Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, which is just the most bizarre place I've ever been. It reminded me a little bit of the city in the Hunger Games, which I saw on the airplane on the way over. So Turkmenistan is run by a dictator who's a dentist, and you'll see all the old Soviet buildings, but the rest of the buildings are all made out of white marble and gold. When you go outside the city, everyone is incredibly poor. And when we were coming back from the Darvaza gas crater, our drivers kept getting out and wiping off the cars. We found out there's a $100 fine for driving into Ashgabat with dust on your car. But this is the Arch of Neutrality. This is the world's largest Ferris wheel, indoor Ferris wheel, which was about to open at the time. And each site had park benches and trash cans in the style of the site. But notice there's not a soul around. It was probably about 110 degrees. And each site had a single person wrapped from head to toe with a broom. And nobody was there. It was very Twilight Zone-like, a huge city with 0 people out. This is the building in the shape of a cobra for the health ministry. And this is the beautiful dress, traditional dress in Turkmenistan. In Australia in 2012, that was where I saw my first koala. But the reason I'm bringing this particular eclipse up is this is one of the places that illustrates how terrain can make a difference between you're seeing the eclipse and not seeing it. So our hotel was down here in Cairns. One group went west in the middle of the night to get onto some higher ground, and they succeeded in getting above some of the coastal clouds. When we woke up in the morning, our hotel was looking toward these knolls of land, and clouds were building up around them. When we looked north, it looked like it was equally cloudy, but I was really worried. I remembered from the Wuhan experience and some other experiences of flying that sometimes water is a little bit clearer than land. It might behoove us to get on a beach out from not looking toward high ground like this. And it took me a while to convince anybody to go. Everybody was saying, no, it looks just as cloudy there. And our leader from our half of the group was Claude Nicollier, the Swiss astronaut who's done 2 of the space repair telescope missions. And I asked him, I said, can we take a bus and go north? And he said, well, nobody seems to want to go. And I couldn't get him to go. I finally said, well, what would you do? And he said, I would go north. I said, I think we have a 100% chance of missing it here, and maybe a 95% chance of missing it farther north, but I think we have a chance. So actually about 16 or 17 of us did hop into a van, and we went north, and yes, there were a lot of clouds. And you can see this is looking south back toward our hotel. This billowy clouds went all the way down as far as the eye could see. But we had rushed up the road. This is another thing I learned. If you got to run, it's okay to do it during the partial phases. The roads are all cleared out. Most people are settled in where they want to be. I was worried we couldn't get up there in time. Actually, we went up 70 miles an hour for about 25 minutes. And then as soon as we could see the sun, we pulled over. And this is our view. And notice, it's so striking that over the water, things are more clear. And as soon as you get over land, this was warm air coming in from the ocean and then being lifted up and billowing over the land. So this is a case where moving and looking a little bit at the terrain worked out. This is us after totality, and that's Claude Nicollier on the right. He was very, very happy that we made that decision. When we got back, we found that all they had gotten was pictures of the streetlights coming on at the hotel. Uganda is a great example of fantastic travel. This is only maximum a 23-second eclipse on land with just a 5-mile wide path. but we decided this would be a fantastic trip. This is the first time we hired private travel. So there was a company in Colorado that specializes in African travel, and they arranged everything for us. So it's like being on a tour, but there were only 6 of us and a driver, and who shepherded us all over Uganda. So this is our group. Most of these people, these 4 are regular Eclipse travelers with Paul Maley's group, and Emma's the one I met in Australia. And what I have also discovered on that trip was the best way to get halfway across the world. I've fallen in love with Air Emirates for several reasons. When I was looking at flights, I noticed the cheapest flight was the longest. It was like 32 hours. I'm like, well, forget that one. And I looked at the other flights. They were all like 26 hours with a 3-hour layover here and a 4-hour layover here, and they were more expensive. I was like, well, let me at least look at this one. I was like, this was 16 hours straight from Houston to Dubai, nonstop, a 9-hour single layover, and then 4 hours on to Entebbe. And I realized, so what happens is you don't wait at an airport at gate, exhausted after traveling all night. You can go to a hotel and lie down. And everybody else had started to make their reservations. I found out that this worked whether you're coming from New York, Boston, Los Angeles, that's where everybody else was coming from. They'd all have a nonstop and then arrive at dinner time. And we decided to go ahead and stay an extra day. So that time we added a day and stayed in Dubai. But I've done this now 3 other times. And most of the time I have a layover long enough to stay in an airport hotel and actually lie down on a real bed and then continue the rest of the way. By far the easiest way, at least for me, to get to the other side of the world. And Air Emirates has the best entertainment with the biggest screens and the most leg room and coach also. So, of course, we saw a few gorillas. We saw children dancing for us in Blindy where the gorillas are. I love this picture of my favorite roommate, Marianne, who's a wonderful portrait photographer. And then we stopped, we initially went up to the big viewing area where the president of Uganda was, but we got nervous because it was partly cloudy and the only road went across the path for 5 miles. And then if you went farther, you dipped out of the path. So we saw the scene and we decided, well, it's partly cloudy. The sun's behind a cloud now. Let's go to this part of the road, the east, where once you're on it, there's a long strip of road that runs close to the center line. So we found this family and we all hopped out of our Jeep and we gave them all glasses. But 10 minutes before totality, this one cloud, which had been kind of off to the side of the sun, started to billow up over it. And we hopped in the bus and we ran, and somebody had an app. They were counting down seconds. We're getting to 15 seconds, 12 seconds, 10 seconds. At 10 seconds, we found a spot away from the cloud. And it was also, like I said, for a short eclipse, a stunningly beautiful inner corona. And Chris Treasel just had a digital SLR. And she did a real quick point up, click, and that was it. She got a beautiful photo. And this is in Ternate, Indonesia. I just like this beautiful picture of this observer. This is one of the few times I had clouds I thought actually enhanced. We didn't quite see the whole corona, but the edges of the corona were blending into the softest possible clouds. And the prominences were pink. It was probably the most ethereal eclipse view I've seen. This is in India for an annular eclipse, southern India, and we hopped out of the bus at a small mosque, and this is the imam. I love this old versus new with the cell phone and the traditional dress. And these are the women in southern India. And we noticed at the mosque, only men came up, and I've kind of ran the eclipse outreach with the visitors at our site while other people took the pictures they needed to take. And now we come to the most recent eclipse in 2023, just on April 20th. I was going to skip this one because most of the trips were cruises, and I had seen this Art Wolf photography series on PBS, and I was like, if I ever have a chance to go to that part of Australia, I want to see the land. And finally, a land trip came up, and it was exactly what I wanted to do. So they don't actually have koalas on that side. This is at the Caversham Wildlife Reserve. Those are imported koalas. They're native to the eastern part of Australia. So in Australia, most of the path was in the water, and a tiny bit of land, Exmouth, had the eclipse. And we actually were on a private group, and we went to this itsy bitsy island over here off of Onslow. And it was a desert island, the first time I've ever been on a desert island. Exmouth, this is an example that sometimes happens when you have sort of a monopoly on places to see an eclipse, was price gouging. They were requiring, some places were requiring 6-day stays. And of course, people, it's a wonderful place, but the people are coming all the way across the world. They don't want to stay in a single place for 6 days. So what happens, they actually ended up not being fully booked. So this is Perth. We started out in Perth, and Perth gave me faith in humanity. It's a city of 2 million. They do have some white light, but virtually all of their lights are shielded. And when they did have an exposed light, probably about a quarter of the intensity of Houston. With their white street lights, I could actually look directly at them and just see little white dots, and they were comfortable to look at. So this is a city of 2 million that doesn't have perfect lighting, but has beautiful soft lighting. And then when you got out to the observatory, they have a public observatory 40 minutes away, their sky was quite a bit better than the Georgia Observatory sky here in Houston. And this is the world's cutest, these are just fun pictures of what I thought was the world's cutest wombat and a quokka. We were supposed to go to an island to see the quokkas, but the night before, this huge Category 5 cyclone hits north of us, well north of us, but enough to cause rough seas, so we couldn't get to the island that day. So we went to the wildlife park and saw them there. I also came for the southern sky. On the left is the Southern Cross and Alpha and Beta Centauri. This is in Carragini National Park. And here's a topsy-turvy Orion with his head pointed to the right. And instead of the Canis Major being below Orion, he's well above Orion. I came for the geology. That's what I had seen in that show. They have extremely old layers. These are 2.5 billion years old. Some of the lowest ones are 3.5 billion, where they're too old to even have fossils. And the soil is extremely red because they do some iron ore mining. They have an enormous amount of iron in the soil over there. Also, they have an alien landscape. So these are scenes from the Cessna caravans we took to Coral Bay. And they do some salt mining. They have natural salt evaporation, and they can mine salt. And I have no idea what this geology is over here. And I came for the aliens. And also the whale shark diving, which was a wonderful thing. So I chose this picture because this is close, very close to what I saw myself. Every place you go has its own T-shirt. We also had the Australian eclipse guru, Kate Russo, with us, and she's right now working with a lot of US cities planning their eclipse events. And she told me that she's likely to do her observing in Uvalde, Texas, or Uvalde County. And we flew to our private island. I was on the first group, so we landed on a completely deserted island. There's one lighthouse there. It's this little triangular shape. It's probably like a couple miles long or even a mile long, tiny little island. And this is a scene Kate Russo had prepared. This is another fun thing to do, had prepared this cutout for crescent suns. And this is Elena, who was seeing her first eclipse, and so she asked to observe with me. So I had her turn around after the partial phases and observe the shadow coming in. And I broke off early so I could keep track of the sun shrinking down. So I missed some shadow bands, I think, that were on the beach, and then told her when to turn around and look. And she was very pleased with her first experience. And this is just a general scene. This is just my quick point and shoot on the left. And I found on the eclipse, there's an Eclipse Chasers Facebook page. This is by far the closest outer corona scene I've seen, which is very close to the naked eye view of the outer corona. But where you see these three large prominences here, that was the brightest I've ever seen naked eye. It was like someone was pointing really bright red laser pointers at us. And I think that's because the moon was smaller. It was only 57 seconds of totality for us. Now, we also have Will Sager here on this call, and he did do the cruises. So he sent these pictures to me today. And so cruises we're able to get to a little bit longer period of totality, and they have a little bit more flexibility in case there's a cloud. And he had sent a very attractive view of the inner corona. So again, the camera doesn't quite get the brilliance, that it gets the shapes better of the prominences. There was this huge one over here arcing over there. But what we saw was just brilliant red laser light. And again, as you can see, the camera cannot get the inner and the outer corona at the same time. The other thing I like about this picture is it really shows the luminousness of the inner corona. And then this is our photographer. His name is Michael Halawana, and his firm is called Aero Tour. He's worked on the Blue Planet television series, the Planet Earth television series. He's working on upcoming versions of those. He's worked for National Geographic. And he just sent this morning, I was hoping to get it to me in time, this drone footage of the shadow passing over our island. So we didn't have a long time to look at it. This is the second shortest eclipse, and it is one of those like, darn, you want it to go on longer. And Texas will have a good 4.5 minutes at the center line, but this eclipse is so long that you can be just a little bit away, just a few miles from the edge, and already be getting up to 2-minute range, and a few more miles than that, you're at 3 minutes. So if you can't get to the center line, there's a broad area of that path where you have a satisfying length of totality. And the other thing, I came back through Dubai and I discovered on a short layover, this is only 4 hours and 15 minutes, I tried the sleeping pods for the first time. And you enter this and all of the hullabaloo of the airport just completely disappears. Very soundproof. This thing starts out as a recliner. You can lift up the seat and put all of your small things in there. You have a light that dims. You have a charger for your phone. And it was so relaxing. So as more airports get this kind of thing, I highly recommend it. Not such a good option for a longer period of time. The 7-hour layover, my hotel across from the airport was only $70 a night, but this was $30 an hour. So it was $95 just to rest there for about 2.5 hours. And if you wait long enough, an eclipse will eventually come to you, but any one spot gets an eclipse on the total eclipse on the average of once every 360 years, unless you're lucky enough to be a place where total eclipses cross. Carbondale, Illinois had totality in 2017 and will again in 2024. Fortunately, you are here in Texas. We get both the annular eclipse on October 14th and the total on April 8th. So I hope you will plan for these. I have a different talk that's a year old now on YouTube, which gets into great detail about locations. But what I can tell you in general is that Texas has by far the best weather along the entire path in the United States. And it's not great differences. South Texas is slightly better. Hill Country is a bit better than Dallas. But overall, you have about a 50% chance of perfectly clear skies and about a 65% chance of seeing it, maybe about 27% of mostly cloudy. The cloudy, there's a website I'm going to give you that you can take a screenshot of. Eclipse2024.org is the best all-purpose website. It has 10 years of satellite photos. And for most of those years, even if you got caught in a cloudy part of Texas, you would be within a reasonable driving range where you could maybe within a few hours get to a clear path. 2023, actually this year, was not a good day. Most of the path was cloudy. I hope it got it out of its system, but the years before that, Texas was completely clear. And this is MrEclipse.com. I do recommend. This is Fred Espenak's website, he was the eclipse guru for NASA for many years. I recommend getting hold of this road atlas if you're going in Texas, because it will show you the relationship between the roads and the path of totality in case you have to run from one place to another, or in case you're just driving in from Houston. But do expect huge traffic jams if you decide to drive at the last minute. You have an entire metropolitan area of 4 million people who are just outside the path. Dallas is in the path, so they're not all going to drive someplace else, but Houston probably will. So plan yesterday. I got an Airbnb a couple years ago, and I was getting really worried because the price gouging has started like crazy. The house like we have now is now 5 to 6 times as expensive. But some of this price gouging in the hill country near the center line is so extreme, I think they're going to lose out. You can go just a little bit away from the center line or find people are more reasonable in that area. It's getting up to, if you rent a house instead of go to a hotel, where if you're close to the center line, it's starting to be maybe $200 per person per night for the capacity of the house. It was about $70 per person per night for our house, but there are people asking $500 per person per night now. And sometimes those people lose out. I had someone bug out on me in Chile who had this big, beautiful house, and he sort of disappeared. He wouldn't respond. My reservation disappeared. The second day I was in Chile at a really nice condominium, he texted me and said, hey, I just want to let you know my house is still available. So don't fall, if you can, try to avoid the worst price gouging. It's a very broad path. You can find reasonable housing. Actually, Dallas is still very reasonable if you look for Airbnbs or VRBO.coms there. And there may still be some hotels renting, and some of the campgrounds are waiting until about 6 months out, but they're developing waiting lists. So what's coming up beyond that? Spain in August 2026. Be prepared for it to be very hot. I understand they're getting quite a bit of heat now already. The 6-minute eclipse where Luxor, Egypt is on the center line. There's also Red Sea cruises in 2027. And then Sydney's on the center line for about a 3.5-minute eclipse in 2028. Kate Russo says she thinks it's the time to do an Australia outback adventure at that time. And then finally, the ultimate eclipse imaging, no camera or naked eye, even the naked eye doesn't get this. This is from heavy processing of multiple images by Miloslav Drukmuller of the Czech Republic. And then my dream eclipse, Saturn. And I'll leave it on this page for just a little bit. You can take a screenshot. These are all of the great planning websites. If you remember only one, eclipse2024.org has links to most of these other sites. Jay Anderson's weather site, weatherspark.com, which gives you weather statistics. And I've probably run really long, but if we have time, I do have Javier Ubier's, I have his site is called up in a browser, and I can just show you very quickly how that works. So has everybody had time to take a look and take a screenshot? If so, this is the end of my talk.
And Debbie, I posted the eclipse2024.org and Xavier Dubier's website in the chat, so you should have access to that.
So I think I need to escape and stop share.
Okay.
I bet it's really late. Yeah, it's pretty late. So
no, it's okay. We did have a few questions in the chat room. So Chris, did you want to ask your question? You were the first one to post something.
Yes. Betty, have you used solar binoculars?
I haven't used solar binoculars. In the past, I just got some Mylar and put it over the ends of my binoculars. So I have observed partial phases with binoculars. And I don't know if Rainbow Symphony still makes it, but for a while they would actually custom make kind of solar filters. You could tell them the circumference of your binoculars, and they could do that. You can also buy the safe material and just rubber band it around the end of your binoculars. But the solar binoculars, I'm assuming they have a bit of are they hydrogen alpha filters, or are they?
Yeah, I believe the Best Buy is promoting solar binoculars.
Yeah, so you can also get solar binoculars. If you're going to do some eclipse chasing on a regular basis, those would be highly recommended. The binocular view is actually, and the naked eye view, the binocular view is probably the best if you're just simply looking at the eclipse.
Right.
You still fit in the whole corona, and you can see the prominences and get a little bit more detail. If you use binoculars, I didn't advise people to do that with the 57-second eclipse. It would be very dangerous even to see the diamond ring. So you would want to do that toward the beginning or the first half of totality. So there's no risk of seeing the sun emerge while you're looking with binoculars. And of course, during totality, you do not need the filtration. So you would also want some kind of standard binoculars for totality.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Krishna. Richard Wilborn had two questions, actually. Richard, do you want to come off mute and ask your questions?
Yeah. Hi, Debbie. You answered one of the questions already, but the first one was, do you know how long the annular eclipse is going to be this October?
Yeah, actually, I haven't studied that closely. You can go to Javier UBA's web interactive map for 2023. I don't remember how long. So with an annular eclipse, the smaller the moon is compared to the sun, the longer it takes to go all the way across. So it's just the length of time it takes the moon to cross from one end to the other. I'm thinking this is a middling one, but I don't remember. It looks like Steve Goldberg knows.
Yeah, I was
4
gonna say-
minutes.
It's gonna be like, I think it's about a 4-minute eclipse in the hill country.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It shows near Sonora about 4 minutes and 58 seconds. So close to 5 minutes.
Yeah, and
about exactly the same time at my house in Canyon Lake. They're both about 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
both eclipses.
Yeah, both eclipses.
Yeah, so the closer you are to the center line with an annular, the more perfectly centered the moon is over the sun when it gets to the midpoint of the eclipse. And if you're off center, then the moon's going to be a little bit closer to one edge than the other, and it'll be a shorter eclipse.
Well, thanks.
Okay. And somebody named Universe Earth asked a question as well. I don't know who that is, but if you want to come off of mute and ask your question, feel free to do so.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, my question is, in this universe, is there any other star apart from sun where we can see the eclipses?
That's a good question. I mean, right now, we're barely able to see other very large exoplanets. So I don't know if they've gotten to the point where, that's a good question, because we have people at the University of Texas McDonald Observatory who are studying exoplanets. And I'll ask that. I wonder if anyone's calculated how common it is or uncommon to have a moon placed. I mean, this is almost, even if you're not religious, it feels remarkably spiritual because of just the coincidence of one moon and having it be perfectly sized to see the whole corona like that. It's an astonishing thing besides its beauty. So it'd be very interesting to find out. I mean, you could have a huge moon where you just completely blocks out the corona and you never get the whole thing. You could have one that's too tiny and you never get that effect. And I don't know when you're getting to you may have something where you're way far out on Pluto or Jupiter, but the sun practically looks like a star. So I don't think you would get that effect out there either. So good question. When we have to move out of the Earth and colonize another M-class planet, we want one that has an eclipses. And by the way, these will not last forever. The moon is receding from us gradually. So I think it's something like 640 million years or something from now, there won't be any more total eclipses.
And by the way, I don't know if people can see this. I'll move this back. I was sent this recently. This is a globe that has all of the eclipses for the next, or basically for this century mapped on it. So you can see the different lines there that show where these will be and what dates they're going to be. And then, for the main central portion, how long that eclipse will last. So I thought this was pretty interesting and was certainly grateful it was sent to me. So do we have any other questions for Debbie before we wrap up?
Joe, I have one.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
First of all, Debbie, your presentation is bringing back memories. I could go talk all day. But anyway, my question is, I've got a lot of very old eclipse filters that I made from, the Mylar plates that I bought from 1,000 Oaks a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And whenever I still use it today on cameras and binoculars and telescopes, and before I use it, I always check to make sure that there's no holes in it. And every few years, I put a little piece of black tape over a hole, but it's still, they generally work. So is there anything to look at for old Mylar except the holes?
Actually, it's the wisdom is to not use eclipse glasses that are older than 3 years. I don't know whether they can deteriorate. I don't think they changed that much, but it might be a safety issue. I remember in the past, and they're not recommending this now because the space blanket has become more and more porous than it used to be. But we used to be able to buy space blanket and just pile up 2 or 3 layers. And I survived all those solar filters. And that's what those men in Indonesia were using. But I think to be safe, the eclipse glasses are so cheap. They're like $2 a set. Yeah. And also Rainbow Symphony sells fresh Mylar material, which is also inexpensive, where you can make your own filters. They just sell the material. So I would recommend be on the safe side. Just get a new set. Do it now that it's in stock. And don't wait till the last minute because there'll be a run on those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But
Okay, Mom, I'll get the good ones. I'll throw away the other ones.
Great. Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah,
You're
it's
absolutely right.
inexpensive. No point in taking a chance.
If
By the way, when I
anybody,
said it was old, 1997, I bought it.
oh wow.
Yeah, if it's kind of a material, not a piece of glass, but a material, I would probably go ahead and get some new. They have it at rainbowsymphony.com.
Thank you.
I was also talking to the folks over at Land, Sea, and Sky. They do have Eclipse glasses available now. I think they have tens of thousands of them. They know there's going to be a tremendous run on them. So I think they said they listed them at $5.99 for 5 glasses, if anybody is interested. So
that's a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just bought 50 from Amazon. They came in a couple days.
Got you. Okay. And then briefly, I know we're getting to the end here, but I just wanted to share this. So Debbie, I know you said you had it up, but I figured we would bring it up here. This is Xavier Joubier's website. I do have the link there in the chat room, but I have 2 tabs open here. One for the annular eclipse, and you can kind of see the path across Texas here. One interesting thing is if you zoom in over here, where are we? Sonora and El Dorado, or El Dorado, some people call it. You can see the center line of this particular eclipse is really close to the X-Bar Ranch. And it just so happens that the El Dorado Star Party coincides with this particular eclipse. So if you're going to be at the El Dorado Star Party, you're going to be really close to the center line there on the last Saturday of that particular star party. So
yeah, that was not a coincidence.
No, exactly.
Yeah, that's terrific. And Joe, why don't you click on one of the maps when you show how all the information comes up?
Absolutely.
And you can really start to see an individual house. It's remarkable.
So this is where, I just clicked on some area near the center line, and this is where it'll tell you here, 4 minutes, 58.2 seconds for the annular solar eclipse. If we go to the total eclipse, right? So you can see kind of the
show the total eclipse.
Expanded view. It goes from Mexico through Texas and then on throughout the continental U.S. there. But let's just take a random spot. Let's go to Gatesville. And if I wanted to observe this from Bald Knob Road, click here along the center line, and it'll tell you, again, 4 minutes, 24 seconds for the total eclipse there, right? So you can really...
me a while. I just want to mention, it took me a while to notice, I didn't notice this for a bunch of eclipses, that on the right above the statistics, there's also the speed of the shadow coming over the ground. So that line.
That umbrella velocity.
Yeah,
so
for your location.
1,643 miles per hour, absolutely. So really interesting, wonderful website, and the fact that you can overlay the path of the eclipse onto a Google map and zoom in, zoom out, manipulate the maps, and really get a good idea of what you're seeing, and to be able to examine, where you might want to go to observe the eclipse.
And if you see any chats from Deborah Moran, that's my mom. So I sent her my version of the.
Okay.
So those are not necessarily me.
And let me see. Do we have any last questions? You can put an address in the left-hand search box. Absolutely, right? So Bob Gillespie had mentioned you can type in an address here in the search box, and it'll take you to that location, absolutely. And Don Adams asked, any plans for an HAS group? That's something we've got to take a look at, Don, to be honest with you. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but we'll certainly see if there's something we can do, for a large group.
I don't know if it's still there, but I saw a new listing that was for a pretty large group that could hold quite a few people. It's like a whole lodge.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. All right. Any last questions for Debbie?
Let me just mention, this is Liz. The Houston Museum of Natural Science is doing some sort of eclipse thing.
They are.
Yep.
Yep.
And by the way, they're also running a tour. I don't know if you're talking about observing here for the partial eclipse, but they're also running a totality tour, because I talked to another group and she couldn't find a hotel room. I think she was looking at Waco, and then she jumped onto the Museum of Natural Science eclipse tour.
Yeah, it was the totality tour, and I'll see if I can pull that up here just so that everybody can see it. I got this email today. So this did come across, but you can go to the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences website and get the itinerary with the pricing and everything else like that there. So Lone Hollow Ranch and Utopia, Texas. That's where it looks like they'll be doing that. Okay. All right. If there are no more questions for Debbie, I will go ahead and get things wrapped up. Debbie, thank you so much. A lot of people saying that they learned a lot from this presentation. Lots of kudos there. So this is absolutely wonderful. We'll have this recorded. So if anybody wants to come back and take a look at the information that Debbie presented here, they'll be able to do that. And I also just wanted to, before we wrap up, let people know, I've got a hydrogen alpha telescope over here. This is a specialized type of solar observing telescope. I've been talking to the folks over at Land, Sea, and Sky, and we'll also have a series of talks going through some of the different and various equipment that you can use, maybe some practical hands-on. And we may actually do that as a hybrid meeting there in person at the Land, Sea, and Sky location, as well as presenting it over Zoom. So I'll send more information out about that. And with that, we are done. So if you like this meeting, we'll have our meetings next month. Our novice meeting will be June 1st at 7 p.m. On Zoom, and our general meeting will be Friday, June 2nd at 7 p.m. on Zoom as well. If you need more information about what it is we're doing as a club, you can visit us at our website, astronomyhouston.org. And if you're a follower or use any of these social media sites, you can follow us at any of the indicated addresses. And as always, if you have questions, you can send us an email at info@astronomyhouston.org. So again, Debbie, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And to the rest of you, stay safe, and we'll see you next month.